I'll start my greeting over.
Thank you. This is what happens when you have a Gen Xer trying to do tech stuff for this sort of thing. Okay, Kara, take it away.
I'm a millennial and I often forget to record as well, Joe. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our forum entitled Preparing GHS Students for the Future. Alumni speak on their experiences in high school and beyond. My name is Kara Fickrig, and I will be your guide today as we listen to the personal stories of Guilford alumni. I graduated from GHS in 2011 and then was awarded a Bachelor's of Science in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from Yale University and a Master's of Public Health in Epidemiology of Microbial Diseases from Yale School of Public Health. I'm now in my 20th something year of school as a PhD candidate in entomology studying mosquitoes at Cornell. I proposed the idea of this forum to the Guilford Human Rights Commission because I believe that the perspective of Guilford High School alumni is absolutely essential to the conversation that's been taking place in town about the Board of Education and the curriculum. The other speakers and I all went through the Guilford school system relatively recently. We then went on to college and into the job market, so we are acutely aware of the ways in which our education either prepared us or left us lacking for our next steps in life. Last year, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, hundreds of people, including many GHS alumni, wrote to the Board of Education to encourage them to take several actions, including conducting a culturally responsive audit of the curriculum and discontinuing the use of the previous mascot. The board members have said that the stories that alumni shared were impactful and eye-opening. I was impressed by how the board members listened to our stories and responded with action. That is exactly how local government is supposed to work. Meanwhile, they've maintained the rigorous and high quality education that prepared us on many other fronts like science, math, reading, writing, and music, all while keeping the students safe during COVID, which is no small feat. So thank you to the BOE for your hard work and for all that you've done to continue to make progress in town. I see that we have some of our members on the call with us today, so thank you so much. However, based on the rhetoric around town, it has become clear that there is a lot of misinformation surrounding the positive change that the BOE is working towards. Since these changes were, at least in part, motivated by the advocacy of GHS alumni last year, we decided to bring a small sample of those stories to the full community. By sharing our personal stories about leaving the Guilford school system and entering the wider world, we hope to help people understand why it is that we feel so passionately about improving the education of Guilford students by incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion into the curriculum. And I recognize that opponents of these changes believe that teaching about topics like systemic racism would be harmful to students. And frankly, it's noble to want to protect your kids. But I think our stories will help to show how, in fact, cloistering students and teaching them a whitewashed version of our country is ultimately harmful, both to them and to the communities that they'll enter after graduating. I also think that our stories will show that in almost every other regard, Guilford education is excellent. I know I personally felt very prepared when I got to Yale for my freshman year, with this one exception. Our town has a moral imperative to prepare our students for the complex world that they'll enter, and to do any less would be to the detriment of our students. Guilford is a special place, as I'm sure all of you on this call would agree, and students here are lucky to receive such wonderful public education, but there is room for improvement. On that note, I would like to thank our Guilford alumni speakers for sharing their stories tonight. It takes a lot of bravery to make yourself vulnerable, so thank you in advance. And thank you to the Human Rights Commission for agreeing to host this forum and for giving us a platform to share our experiences. And thank you all for being here tonight to listen to our stories. Positive change starts when we open ourselves up to new points of view and perspectives. As you listen, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, as Joe mentioned at the beginning, and we'll try to answer them at the end of our session. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Sam Menotti, who graduated from GHS in 2014. The floor is yours, Sam.
Thank you, Kara. All right. Bear with me, I'm a little bit nervous. I'm speaking to you all today as an alum of Guilford High School and current elementary educator. I graduated from Guilford in 2014 and went on to study at the University of Delaware. Since graduating college, I've worked as an early literacy tutor, I was an advisor at a high school. I student taught in a kindergarten classroom in Philadelphia, and I'm currently teaching 3rd and 4th grade at a social justice focused school in Seattle. I've had a lot of experiences working at schools different from Guilford, working with students from different backgrounds, and I'm committed in my own work to having conversations with students surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm speaking to you all today because I do not feel my time at Guilford prepared me enough to enter these spaces I'm in now as an educator. Since graduating, I've had to do a lot of unlearning and a whole lot of relearning. There are gaps in my education I had to fill. There are harmful perspectives I had to shake off, and there are hard conversations about race I had to work through, having not been given the skills to have them while at Guilford schools. To give some insight into my experience, at the school I'm teaching at now, I recently taught a lesson on banned books. For those of you who may not know, banned books are books that are kept out of schools because some people don't agree with the content in them. You might have heard of some like The Catcher in the Rye or The Kite Runner. More recently, books that have been banned have included books that talk about race, gender, or even just include Black and Indigenous people of color. An example of a book is May Among the Stars that was banned and is about Mae Jemison, the first Black woman in space. When I led the discussion with my students about banned books, we talked about censorship and what happens when we censor the materials that students have access to in schools. We learned the importance of learning about people who are different from us and teaching the truth. At Guilford, I feel much of the material that was taught to us was censored, and I often felt I wasn't given the full truth. The stories and perspectives we were told were whitewashed, and we were taught by majority white faculty. Needless to say, there were a lot of gaps. I can't recall many times learning about anyone other than a white person, except for Martin Luther King Day. We were not exposed to different cultures, different worldviews, different holidays. This was a loss on multiple levels. Learning about cultures and experiences other than our own expands our ability to empathize with others and connect and work with others different from ourselves. The students that I teach now have access to banned books and are having conversations, asking questions, and benefiting from learning about people and perspectives different from their own. My students are in 3rd and 4th grade. These are conversations that I was kept from having until college. I can't even imagine how much better I could connect with and teach my students had I been able to learn these things and have these conversations during my time at Guilford. This personal loss is significant, but even more so, where does this leave students who attended Guilford schools that came from different cultures, backgrounds, genders, and identities? At Guilford, the material we were taught was not inclusive to these students. Often these students were either singled out or ignored in the classroom. How can students embrace their full identities when they do not see themselves in the material being taught in school? The worst part is I didn't even notice the way my classmates were being othered while at Guilford because I was so ignorant at the time. It took leaving the Guilford bubble to recognize the moments I could have said something and stood up for them. But the reality is, we weren't taught how to talk about race at Guilford. We were taught not to see color. And this kept a lot of students from being seen and supported by their educators. In looking at the way that I was censored in my education at Guilford, the subject that stands out the most was history. At Guilford, I felt most of the history we were taught left out perspectives, focused on mostly the heroes or deemed winners in history, and left little room for students to form their own opinions. It's embarrassing looking back at the countless hours I spent studying in my AP US history class and knowing how much we weren't taught. I can't recall learning about the Black Panther Party, sundown towns, Juneteenth, redlining, white flight, or any of the deeply rooted systemic racism in our country that still exists today. There was limited education on the various Indigenous people and their tribal governments, even though a large population still lives here in Connecticut today. The teaching of Thanksgiving was far from the truth, and in many ways utilized harmful and stereotypical narratives of Native Americans. We did not go in depth on the inequalities that women face and the history of feminism, nor were we told the large amount of founding fathers that owned and enslaved people, nor did we dive into the racism that is felt today in Confederate symbols. What we did do is spend a large amount of time learning about US imperialism and the spreading of Christianity. We barely touched, though, on the impacts of colonialism, the forced assimilation of culture and religion, and the history of discrimination of non-white groups in our country. The vast majority of the world history we learned was Eurocentric, and so much of it left out perspectives of non-white populations. As I relearn history, it continues to shock me just how much was left out of what we were taught, and it's taken me years to get a fuller picture of the truth. I had the opportunity to watch the Human Rights Commission meeting that took place in August and was able to hear some of the plans Guilford has made to bring more diversity, equity, and inclusion into its schools. I'm excited that Guilford is taking these first steps, but I encourage Guilford to do more. I saw the programs are being implemented in 5th through 12th grade. This is wonderful, but elementary schools need to be doing the same work. I've sat with kindergartners and had in-depth conversations about race, history, and culture. And when you have those foundational conversations with kids that young, they start noticing race more in what is being taught. I haven't explicitly taught a lesson about race with my 3rd and 4th graders this year, but race has come up nearly every day because race exists in nearly everything we do, as does gender and other identities. My students have noticed that the many banned books were about people of color without me even telling them. And there is so much more they notice when they are not censored. Elementary students are capable and eager to have these conversations. Not only this, but it's necessary for students to have these conversations at a young age. So much of who we are and our beliefs are shaped while we are young. Our elementary schools need to have these same programs. I also saw that Guilford is implementing these programs in social studies and language arts classrooms. This is exciting, but what about math and science? Numbers and data are not only incredibly powerful social justice tools, but they also allow students to connect what they're learning to the world around them. There are so many perspectives that have been left out of science, research that has not been inclusive to all racial groups, and racism is fully present in scientific history and needs to be taught. Guilford is making great first steps with these programs, but we still need to go beyond these efforts and tackle bigger harmful systems in place in our schools. The leveling of students by their abilities and the over-focus on standardized testing in our schools needs to be re-examined. There is no doubt that Guilford schools prepared me for the hefty workload that I would get starting college. But Guilford also left me with testing anxiety and a fixed mindset of what I could achieve. I didn't realize how much this fixed mindset had harmed me until a responsive math class that I took this past year while getting my master's. We were given a math problem and we were asked to solve it however we wanted, whatever way made the most sense to us. I solved the problem and shared it with the class. I was shocked when my professor told me that the way that I solved the problem was an actual strategy. All my time at Guilford, I thought that I did math wrong because my brain worked and solved problems differently. Diversity, equity, and inclusion doesn't just mean teaching more about diverse perspectives in books. It means looking at the students that you have right in front of you and accommodating to the diverse ways that they learn. It means creating inclusive spaces for students where students feel free to learn in ways that are best for them. It also means ensuring that all students feel supported and have the same opportunity to succeed. This starts by looking at the culture we are creating in our schools with these larger systems. The vast majority of schools across the country need to put more effort in creating programs to promote anti-bias work. Guilford has the opportunity to be one of those schools. They have the opportunity to allow students to graduate more informed about the world, to become critical thinkers, to challenge inequities, and to know the truth about our history. I know this type of education can positively impact students. I've seen how it makes them feel seen, empowered, and passionate to create change in their own communities. I'll leave you with this. When my students learned about banned books in my class, the learning didn't stop there. My students were upset that so many books that they loved weren't available in some classrooms and that other kids couldn't read them. They were inspired to work with our librarian to create an entire banned book section at our school library, so every class could learn about and read banned books. We even talked about how some students were protesting to show their support of banned books. My students said that if it was their school that had banned books, they would be protesting too. Students want to learn the truth, and being able to learn it is necessary in creating a more just world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. That's a wonderful, very comprehensive story to start out our evening. Thank you. I'd now like to introduce Courtney Streeto, who graduated from GHS in 2012. Take it away, Courtney.
Thanks, Kara. Hi, I'm Courtney. I graduated from Guilford High School in 2012. Since graduating, I've practiced as a registered nurse and recently became a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner. My doctoral research at Fairfield University is what sparked my interest in unconscious bias, which is what I would like to talk about tonight. Growing up in Guilford, I always heard the phrase, "I do not see color." This is often used by the speaker to imply that they did not judge others based on how they look. In essence, they are not racist. I fully believe that this phrase is well intended, though at its core, it does create its own host of problems. For one, as a child, I took this phrase quite literally. Growing up in a primarily white town as a white person, I would notice when there was someone in my class that did not look like me. I tried very hard not to notice that they had a different skin color, but I did. I thought that that made me racist. It wasn't until I left GHS and went to college in New Haven that I realized that seeing color was not actually racist, but imperative to creating an environment where all people can reap the benefits of society. This is where the second problem arises. In saying that we do not see color, we are minimizing the very real struggles of people of color and the disparities that they still potentially face today. As a healthcare worker, I would like to highlight some of the issues that are still seen in this field. Disparities that are so serious that they were acknowledged by the American Medical Association in 2020. Black patients have had the worst outcomes of all races in the United States. One of the reasons for this is a legitimate historical basis for mistrust in healthcare. The Tuskegee experiments, for example, took impoverished Black men with syphilis and kept them unaware of available treatments so that the effects of untreated syphilis could be studied. This kind of abuse by healthcare professionals has led to a lasting mistrust of the medical field that can be seen even today with COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy. Repercussions of historical segregation have also led to lesser access to healthcare. For this reason, Black Americans are not only more likely to contract COVID-19, but they're also less likely to receive adequate treatment. But we rarely hear about those issues in Guilford. Here are a few examples of the disparities that I have seen. In mental health, Black patients are more likely to receive a diagnosis of a severe, persistent mental illness and be involuntarily hospitalized, but they are less likely to have the minimally adequate treatment while hospitalized or to have case management or follow-ups after discharge. When compared to white patients, preterm births and low birth weight rates are higher for Hispanic patients and 1.5 and 2 times higher for Black patients. Black women are also more likely to have higher rates of STIs and delays in treating for them. When they are treated, Black women are more likely to have longer hospital stays and complications. In terms of pain management, Black patients are significantly less likely to receive opioids than white patients, or they may receive no pain management at all. And this holds true for pre-hospital medications given by EMTs as well. Looking at another minoritized population, Hispanics are only half as likely to receive opioids. Those who do receive opioids are more likely to be urine drug tested after discontinuation of drug therapy than white patients. And why is that? Unconscious bias has a very real impact on healthcare and how we interact with people in society in general. Often this stems from systemic racism and from education systems that allow unconscious biases to develop unconfronted. This is especially true in predominantly white towns such as Guilford. To help explain what I mean by unconscious bias, I want to present 2 scenarios. First, imagine you're sitting in your car alone in the dark and a person walks by with a hoodie pulled over their eyes. You lock your door because you feel unsafe. Now, imagine you're walking down the street and you see money in a plastic bag change hands on the corner by teenagers during school hours. You believe you have witnessed a drug deal. I want you to take a moment to imagine the people in these scenarios. If you imagine these people as anything other than colorless figures, perhaps there is an unconscious bias there. Perhaps we see color a little more than we thought. Now, this is not to say that we are bad people, and likely we've never intentionally discriminated against another person, but biases can still exist unseen to us. I admit I have experienced them myself. It is important to acknowledge that though we may not be racist, we should still strive to be anti-racist and deconstruct persistent biases. This is why we need to talk about diversity and systemic racism. If we are not immersed in a diverse population while growing up, it's easy to develop a bias, be it from television, social media, or whitewashed history books. It's also easy to tell ourselves that it's not happening, that racism doesn't exist anymore, that it ended with the civil rights movement. It's even easier to believe it because we learned so little past this point in history. That is why we need conversations about race. We need to increase the amount of culturally sensitive education in Guilford's curriculum. This is how we can help ourselves to fully understand the inequities that still exist in the world. As a nurse, I have to see color in order to recognize that some of my patients are statistically at a much higher risk of negative outcomes than others. I have to make a conscious effort to assess pain and provide pain management equally amongst patients of every race. If one of my patients is escalating, when choosing how to de-escalate, I assess if there is any unconscious bias guiding my decision, as recent literature suggests that Black patients are more likely to be physically restrained, and I do not want to contribute to that statistic. I believe it is my duty to continue to learn more about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because that helps us to see any unconscious biases that may still exist in us. Just this past week, I learned that Black patients are more likely to get a schizophrenia diagnosis, even if that diagnosis doesn't fit, and they are less likely to be treated for depression. Upon reflection, I can see the truth in this, but as a staff nurse, I never realized it or even questioned it. This shows I still have a lot to learn. There are still so many unconscious biases guiding how we interact with our clientele. Until people of all skin colors can reap the same benefits from society, we do need to see color. I encourage Guilford to continue having these conversations, and I applaud the current Board of Education's efforts to address this gap in the Guilford school system. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. I'd now like to introduce Michael Rowe, who graduated from GHS in 2009.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Rowe. I graduated from Guilford High School in 2009, Brown University in 2014, and I'll be starting at Harvard Law School next fall. Before law school, I worked in various fields, including finance, nonprofit, and documentary filmmaking. During my time at Guilford High School, I experienced firsthand racism and discrimination that's deeply embedded in our society today. I firmly believe that our education has a potential to combat such racism, which is why I'm here to advocate for the need to include diversity, equity, and inclusion in our high school curriculum, and to help create safe and supportive school environments for all students. I was born in New York City, but I moved to Seoul soon thereafter due to my father's promotion overseas. When I was 8, the Asian financial crisis, IMF, left my father unemployed and our family reeling in debt, and forced us to move back to the US and into our grandparents' small one-bedroom apartment in Flushing, Queens. As my father struggled to secure a job, my mother, a classically trained opera singer, became a nail salon technician to support our family. My parents' relentless pursuit of providing my brother and me with a quality education eventually brought us to Guilford, Connecticut, a small suburban town. It's around 95% white. Although growing up in a multi-generational household of Korean immigrants had its challenges, it also offered some crucial advantages. Our close-knit family made it easier to overcome obstacles. My parents continued to defy expectations with hard work and ambition, while my grandparents infused cultural mores, traditions, and wisdom into their caregiving. Even so, I have painful recollections of being made to feel ashamed of my Korean American identity, especially during my time at GHS. From the stench of fermented kimchi seeping out of my lunchbox, to the daily derogatory slights about my ethnicity or my appearance, I was often reminded of my minority status. For example, during a home fencing meet against North Haven, several of my teammates used their fingers to stretch out their eyes into slits for cheap laughs. At a pasta party, I remember sitting around playing a question game that quickly began to play on racial stereotypes, and teammates laughing as they said, quote, "All Asians have small penises," quote. In the classroom, the catchphrase, "because you're Asian," was something that I grew very accustomed to hearing, and despite my best efforts, even believing for myself. Like many of my peers, I found college to be a shockingly difficult transition. In the classroom, I felt extremely unprepared to discuss topics on race, racism, and society. For instance, I had never heard the terms implicit bias, intersectionality, or microaggression until my first year reading seminar. And meanwhile, most of my peers seemed much more educated in this regard, more willing to engage in discussions with professors and each other, more familiar with the terminology, the acronyms, the historical concepts, events. And this realization was both inspiring and discouraging. On one hand, I felt very fortunate to be there, while on the other hand, I felt as though the education that I received was in some ways inadequate. Exacerbates also the imposter syndrome I already felt as a first-generation college student. Over time, I began to cultivate a more effective set of tools for engaging with topics such as inequality, racism, and discrimination. But it took a lot of learning and unlearning, both inside and outside the classroom. Since graduating from college, I've been fortunate enough to have traveled extensively to experience many different cultures. I've dealt with personal and professional challenges, and I've accumulated years of real world experiences that have forced me to re-examine issues of race and identity. I'd like to clarify that though my time at Guilford High School wasn't perfect, I'm proud to be a Guilford High School resident and a graduate. As a Brown alum, I have the privilege of conducting alumni interviews for Guilford High School students each year. My appreciation for our town grows with each passing year, and I would not hesitate to send my children to Guilford High School if given the opportunity someday. In hindsight, however, I look back to my Guilford education and my transition to college with both gratitude and regret. It's like a missed opportunity kind of feeling. Because while I recognize that Guilford High School has afforded me the kind of education that my grandparents dreamed of when they escaped North Korea, I also believe that there is ample room to revise our current curriculum. I believe our current curriculum can better serve our students for not just college, but our personal and professional lives by incorporating more diversity, equity, and inclusion into the curriculum. My personal experiences with racism lead me to believe that there is room for us, especially those of us that are parents, teachers, and recent graduates, to think about ways in which we can better create safe and supportive school environments for all students. So in closing, I'd like to thank you all for allowing me to share my story and express my concerns. This forum has presented me with the opportunity to not just revisit my high school experience, but envision what I would like to see from our high school curriculum. I humbly ask that you consider my story as you wrestle with the future of our high school curriculum. I hope that you can see how these issues have affected me personally and why I'm advocating that these issues be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for sharing your story with us. I'd now like to introduce Sarah Patoccini, who graduated from GHS in 2012.
Can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay, I'm using a new device that I wasn't planning to use, so, because, yeah, just had to do that. So first, I just want to thank Sam and Courtney and Michael for sharing their testimony so far. I feel incredibly humbled to be sharing a story alongside them, a take on alongside them. Okay, hello. My name is Sarah Patoccini, and I'm a writer and adjunct teaching professor at Syracuse University, where in 2012 I graduated with my BFA in music performance, and this past spring with my MFA in creative writing. When I'm not teaching classes or writing myself, I'm spending time with my son Sol, teaching private violin and viola lessons or working on a painting. In the fall of 2013, I enrolled in Syracuse University's Intergroup Dialogue program, a series of courses, dialogues run by the university's School of Education. My course specifically focused on race and ethnicity, terms I felt familiar with in ideology, if not in experience. The class was made up of 15 female identifying students from varying disciplines across campus, and I approached our first few sessions with a humanitarian and idealist demeanor. So much of who I became over the course of that semester is the reason that I'm writing this today, or that I wrote this before, that I'm sharing this with you all today. But I would be remiss not to recount the moment I woke up, so to speak. We were embarking on something called the Fishbowl Experiment, a term modified in more recent years to intragroups. During this exercise, the class was split up into two groups, white women to the room off of the main, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color to remain in the class. Each group was given a set of questions to answer as an intragroup and later bring back to the circle to share out. Some examples of questions we were asked were things like, what do you like about being a person of your race, ethnicity? If this is a difficult question to answer, why? And is it easy or hard to be a person of your race on this campus? After a short break, we were all called back into the circle. The white woman asked to share out first. The fishbowl gets its name because while sharing out our answers to the prompts, we were seated on the floor in the middle of the classroom, while women of color sat in a circle of chairs around us. While us white women spoke, the women of color listened determinedly. They were quiet, asked careful and diligent questions, and held space for us kindly and patiently. When it was time for the women of color to share their answers, them on the floor while the white students in the circle surrounded them, I reciprocated as I figured everyone else did. Halfway through, I looked up from the students of color in the center and took stock of my white classmates. 3 of the 5 of them had their computers out, typing away furiously, not paying attention to the presenters at all. What's worse was I knew what they were working on, as they'd alluded to it earlier, the homework due for class that day. I thought about calling over to them to perk up and pay attention, but that would have interrupted my BIPOC classmates in the middle of such vulnerable retellings of self-loathing, shame, and feelings of inadequacy and social irrelevancy. Before I had time to react in the midst of profound embarrassment, there was a knock at the sliding glass door. One of the white women who had been on her computer looked up before turning her attention to the knock where a Jimmy John's delivery person was waiting, a bag of sandwiches thrown over his left arm. Oh my God, she said, I'm so sorry, I'll just be a minute. As I'm sure others like me will note, Guilford Public Schools taught me that racism was a thing of the past, a set of beliefs the sour of the world believed in, but that racism itself had effectively lost. I was taught the good people of the US had stood up in the face of the oppressors and that the oppressors sat down and folded, went to jail or retreated to their basements to suffer and internalize their well-earned humiliation and defeat. But in time I was privy to the truth, which is not so much that Guilford Public Schools had lied to me, stuffed me full of nonsense pertaining to the realities of life in the US for minorities and other marginalized groups, but that places like Guilford would continue to bring children into the world with no concept or why or how they were afforded the privileges they benefit from, and not out of willful ignorance, but out of misguided belief that what makes happy, successful, and fulfilled adults is a childhood free from the knowledge of the evils just outside our city limits. The girls in my class who had chosen to ignore their BIPOC peers were nice people. This is important. They were smart, caring, and lovely women whose intentions were never to ignore or dismiss the experiences of their classmates with marginalized identities, but they had failed them nonetheless. While women of color around them admitted to being terrified, to sharing such personal details, while they wept about the shame they felt as kids for having dark skin, while they disclosed feelings of alienation and hatred on the very campus that had promised to accept them unconditionally, those very kind, well-intentioned women abandoned them unthinkingly for Grubhub and whatever. I do see Guilford in somewhat the same way, a lovely town filled with kind and well-intentioned people, and I am so proud to come from Guilford. But because we live in a world that is part of an oppressive system, we are part of that oppressive system nonetheless. We are non-exempt. Because many of us in Guilford do not have to confront the realities of inequity by the nature of our identities, we have no concept of the ways in which our actions, big and small, add to and maintain systems of oppression. We cannot tell when the fulfillment of our own appetites comes at the expense of undermining the well-being of those less privileged than we are, and we only exacerbate this equality by burying our heads in the sand. As a mother of a kindergartner myself, I know our priorities will always be our children. But I also know that my child will fail if he is not taught to act in solidarity with all people he comes to know and love and learn from. I will know I have failed him if I let him grow up to make mistakes that cause those around him to feel more alone, lost, and abandoned. Paulo Freire writes that we are only solidary with the oppressed when we stop regarding the oppressed as an abstract category and see them as persons who have been unjustly dealt with, deprived of their voice, cheated in the sale of their labor. When we stop making pious, sentimental, and individualistic gestures and risk an act of love. I am asking the people of Guilford to risk an act of love. We will go only further into darkness if we continue to make abstract the realities of our racialized presence. Forbidding our children from learning about racism, systemic and systematic oppression is only setting them up for failed relationships, human connection, and a sense of unity that I'll venture to surmise we are all at a deficit for right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'd now like to introduce Emily Breeze, who graduated from GHS in 2010.
Hello, my name is Emily Breeze, and I graduated from GHS in 2010, fully unprepared for the world as it exists, but very prepared to presume leadership positions. I think my story is similar to many here tonight. I was a kid who was good at school, and so I assumed I knew everything I needed to know to be an effectual communicator of truths, most of which I obviously knew because I got good grades, and how could I have more to learn if I got a 5 on AP Human Geo, the most rigorous of all the social studies classes? I'm being facetious for effect. I know sarcasm and parody aren't going over well in public forums right now, so to be explicit, my Guilford High School education led me to believe I knew everything, specifically because I was regularly told it was a good education, because our standard for a good education is being highly educated in white-centered history, art, and science. It didn't take long after graduating GHS to be corrected in this assumption, often in painful and embarrassing ways at college. I was defensive. I had no tools when confronted by my own inadequacies. I feel like I'm still being corrected because I'm still trying to untangle the realities I was raised with and taught at Guilford High School. I feel like I don't even remember all the harm I perpetrated on my fellow GHS classmates because my brain didn't think to record what felt to me like a pedestrian comment or joke in the context of a school that did nothing to disrupt racist systems. Truly and honestly, it is very unfun to know that you have a series of uncorrectable, harmful acts in your personal history that you can never fully apologize for. What's more unfun, though, is being on the receiving end of those actions, as many of the speakers tonight can attest. If we attempt to protect white students from learning about racism, we protect them from experiencing empathy until they are fully launched into a world that won't provide a healthy learning environment the way school is designed to. Far worse, we choose to prioritize the potential guilt or shame of white students over the emotional, mental, and physical safety of everyone else. Learning about upsetting things feels upsetting. Doing upsetting things is worse. I don't want Guilford to be a place that churns out white students who don't understand racism. I super don't want the students of color at Guilford Public Schools to be harmed by fellow classmates, teachers, or administrators who don't understand racism. I want us to move forward towards a kinder, more equitable community, one that does not ignore our past or current realities, but instead assumes we are capable of facing them. I'm so grateful to be here tonight, and I'm very grateful to Kara and Joe for organizing and my fellow participants for sharing their story. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Hard act to follow. I'll now be sharing my own personal story. Again, my name is Kara, and I graduated from GHS in 2011. And at that time, I believed that racism was an exclusively overt and active evil, a word that is relegated to those who explicitly believe that white people are superior to people of color. I also believed that racism was essentially a thing of the past, largely defeated during the civil rights era. As I went through college, I mostly took science classes, and so I never really challenged that particular worldview. But that changed my senior year when I was suddenly confronted by the depths of my ignorance about race and racism in the US. In the wake of the murders of Michael Brown and Eric Garner, a racial reckoning was taking place on Yale campus that year. I tried my best to support my best friend, who is Black, but I ended up making things harder for her. I continuously committed microaggressions that I was completely oblivious to, and so I repeatedly hurt her, even as I was trying to help. Our friendship very nearly ended that year because she had to distance herself from me to protect her own mental health. And meanwhile, I could not understand what I had done wrong. I loved my best friend, and I couldn't imagine that I'd done anything to hurt her. And it was heartbreaking to imagine that I had. I sought out the counsel of some of our other friends who pointed me towards resources to educate myself. And so I started the arduous process of introspection, unlearning, and learning anew. With my newfound knowledge, I was able to remember situations that had occurred and could finally identify the microaggressions I had committed. And so many months after our initial conversation, I was able to sincerely apologize, recognizing the depths to which I had hurt her. And I am so grateful that I took that time to educate myself before I tried to heal our friendship. Because if I hadn't, the conversation would have gone very differently. And I guarantee I would have ended up hurting her even more. When she first told me that the reason that our friendship had deteriorated was because of my ignorance about race and racism, I believed that she was simply wrong. And I could have stayed in that frame of mind, believing that my friend had been overly sensitive and that I could not possibly have been in the wrong because I loved her and I never intended to hurt her. But I decided to trust my best friend when she told me that I had blind spots and that I was ignorant of her experience as a Black person in this country. And so I tried to open my mind to see things from a different perspective. And I was shocked to learn about everything that I had not learned in high school. My newfound knowledge fundamentally changed the way I view race and racism in the US. For example, we never learned about how redlining prevented Black families from building generational wealth, which drives the current wealth gap between white and Black families, and in turn has myriad implications for the perpetuation of inequality into the future. How can we expect Guilford students who are taught the dogma of colorblindness to resolve a systemic issue that is rooted in racist policies? The simple question, or the simple answer, is that we cannot. And this has been increasingly recognized across different disciplines. I've seen this play out in academia. As I said in my introduction, I am a PhD candidate in entomology at Cornell. The importance of a diverse and inclusive academic environment is well established. However, entomology and many other disciplines remain largely white. As academia makes an effort to resolve this issue, DEI is a priority for many departments. I now feel like I can work constructively on that effort, but only because I did a lot of that difficult unlearning and self-education in the time since I left Guilford. This is now an expectation for anyone who seeks to progress through academia. Most faculty jobs require a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement that details how the candidate has worked to promote DEI in the past and how they'll continue to do so once in a position of power. At the very minimum, this work requires an understanding of the different challenges that face people with different identities. By including diversity, equity, and inclusion into the curriculum, Guilford schools can help to avert painful situations like the one in which I found myself. By teaching about topics like microaggressions and systemic racism, we can reduce the harm caused to people with minoritized identities, both in Guilford and in the communities that students will enter after graduating. And in doing so, we can help our students become productive, constructive members of the society that increasingly recognizes the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. My story is one of many, and certainly not the most important. I'm hopeful that community members are interested in a cross-generational dialogue to better understand the impact that local government can have on the world outside of this one small town. And I'm looking forward to the many ongoing discussions that I hope will come from this forum. So thank you for listening to my personal story. I now want to share a couple messages from people who were not able to join us tonight, but really did want to share their stories. So I'm just going to share my screen. All right. First, we will hear from Jay Geary, who graduated in 2015. Oh, wait, you know what? I didn't click audio. I always forget to do that. I need to share sound. Okay, share sound. Okay, we'll hear from Jay Geary, who graduated in 2015, and they sent us this audio to listen into.
As a GHS alumnus and relative of students still in the Guilford public school system, the recent pushback against diversity and inclusion within our curriculum deeply concerns me. Whether it be in online forums or in letters to the editor, I've repeatedly seen claims that current curriculum is promoting discrimination and indoctrinating people's children. Even prior to the recent debate over the Board of Education, I witnessed townspeople go as far to claim Guilford doesn't have an issue with racism, or that the youth is too sensitive. While I can no longer personally speak to what's being taught in the classroom, I can assure you, as an adopted Korean American, that Guilford has a racism issue, and it's certainly not new. There isn't a singular correct way to address the issue of racism, but a fundamental starting point toward progress is acknowledging it exists. The current initiatives to incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, as part of the GPS curriculum are essential to taking this first step. I applaud the current GPS administration and Board of Education for advocating for these changes, as this gives me hope that future generations of Guilford won't have to experience the same intrusive and emotionally exhausting questions that I endured due to a lack of cultural awareness. Most of my employment to date has been in Guilford, ranging from local grocery stores to a medical office. The common factor across all my jobs is the frequent question of, where are you really from? Or some variant. At one job, the first thing a customer asked me was, are you Chinese or Japanese? I politely responded, neither, I'm Korean, only to get a, oh, one of those Koreans. To say I felt like little more than an object to this person would be an understatement. At the same job, I worked with my mom, who happens to be white. As I mentioned before, I'm adopted. I still referred to her as Mom when working, which would result in rude stares and sometimes even the blatant question of, that's your mother? Well, I'd like to say it stopped there. It didn't. There was a time when a customer inquired about a phone left on the counter. I reassured her that it was my mom's and that she was out walking in the field. The customer then proceeded to tell me she thinks my mom actually was walking toward the parking area, referencing the previous customer I helped, who happened to appear of Asian descent. The rude invasive questioning and unwarranted comments persisted into my next job. At the time, I was still going by my legal name, which is Swedish in origin. I've been asked, is that Oriental? Or if someone was less blunt and I took the time to mention it's Swedish, I'd get a, well, you don't look Swedish, as if I wasn't already painfully aware of that fact, being the only person of color in my entire family, including extended. Some may argue that these comments were well-intentioned. And perhaps that's true. However, that doesn't change the fact that these questions left me feeling alienated. Each time it felt as if people were questioning my place in the community and simply my right to exist just as I am. Some may argue that these are singular anecdotes that don't reflect the community as a whole. However, the fact that I had these experiences regularly from a wide variety of people reinforces the feeling that there's a community-level assumption that I do not belong here. My experiences underscore the need for the school system to maintain and expand upon current DEI initiatives. By fostering cultural awareness, I hope this town can grow into an environment where people, such as myself, aren't under constant scrutiny and don't feel the need to justify their place in the community. The process of remediation, healing, and communal growth will be hard work, and at times it will require an uncomfortable level of introspection and discussion. However, change is rarely comfortable. While I acknowledge the well-meaning sentiment that we are all one human race, true unity arises from accepting difference, not ignoring it or trying to make everyone the same. I stand by the current DEI initiatives and will continue to support these efforts in hopes that our town can experience a full-fledged cultural change so that all residents of Guilford know they belong.
While Jay isn't here to hear it, I just want to thank Jay for sharing this message with us. We'll now listen to a message from Eliza Summerlin, who graduated from GHS in 2009.
Hi there, my name is Eliza Summerlin. I graduated Guilford High School in 2009. I use they, them pronouns, and I currently live in Seattle, Washington. And I'm not able to be there with you at the forum in person or live on Zoom tonight, so I just wanted to record something for you to air at the forum because what's going on in Guilford is really important to me, and it's something that I want to be able to comment on as an alumni from Guilford High School. So I think we all can agree that when we graduated from Guilford and we were sent off into the world, there were a lot of things that shocked us about that experience, where we realized that the homogenous upper middle class environment that we grew up in is really not the norm. And we had to confront a lot of our own biases and a lot of our own prejudices and unlearn many harmful things that were just taken as the status quo in Guilford. And I think a big way that we could change that experience for not only graduates of Guilford High School, but also the people who we go on to interact with, is by updating the curriculum. And this has many ramifications for social justice, for combating racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia. I think we were taught such a whitewashed version of history, and Guilford has such a reverence for its colonial past that can be really, really harmful. And so while all of those are really important things to unlearn, I want to speak tonight specifically about my own experience and ways that a different education could have benefited me. So I'm 30 years old now. I'm a trans non-binary person. At the time that you're watching this, I'm going to be getting top surgery in 2 days. And it's taken me 12 years since graduating Guilford High School to be able to come to terms with my transness, to be able to come to terms with my queerness, and to be able to take some steps that have helped me step into my full identity. And I have done so much reflecting about my time in Guilford and my time at high school, and how those identities were not talked about in any way. If they were talked about, it was not with acceptance and love. It was as if they were unusual, bizarre ways to exist in the world. And that was really harmful for me for a long time. And I was angry for a long time, trying to unlearn ingrained homophobia and ingrained transphobia within me. And I think that it's so important that we take steps through our education and through the culture that education facilitates to create a more welcoming and diverse place where kids can live their true self, can live as their true selves and really step into their truth and step into their power. You know, for a long time, I really felt like I was a late bloomer because there were so many things in life I didn't get to explore until my, mid to late 20s. And I don't wish that for other people. And I think Guilford really is a place that does value people being themselves and values individuality and the characteristics that make us unique. And so I think it's just incredibly important that we take a look at the curriculum and we figure out ways that we can talk about gender diversity, ways that we can talk about sexuality, ways that we can shed light on aspects of history that aren't talked about in the current way that we teach history and that we educate. And I also think this goes beyond the actual content of what's taught in high school, and it can be, ways that we facilitate teachers asking students for their pronouns, ways that we can, have queer teachers who are role models and really foster a culture that is far more accepting than the one that at least I grew up in. So I just wanted to speak to you all today and share a little bit about my experience and let you know that I really support auditing the curriculum and seeing what cultural shifts we can make throughout our education to make it a more welcoming place for all different kinds of people, myself included. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you to Eliza for sending us this video as well. I'm really glad that we were able to share both Jay and Eliza's stories with you, despite them not being able to be here with us today. All right, let's see. Now I would like to introduce Heather O'Connell, who graduated from GHS in 2014.
Thanks, Kara, and thank you, everyone. It's been so great to hear the different perspectives. So I'm Heather O'Connell. I graduated from GHS in 2014. I then went on to receive a BA in International Relations from the University of Maryland, and I now work in higher education fundraising. So when I graduated from GHS in 2014, I really felt like I could not be more prepared to enter the real world. Academically, we were told how prepared we would be. We knew we were receiving a great education, that our test scores were high, and that we would excel in college. I chose to go to the University of Maryland, a school with a larger student population than the population of Guilford. That was on purpose. I wanted something different. The University of Maryland is not some remarkably diverse school, but compared to Guilford, compared to the private universities I looked at, it was the most diverse place I could imagine at the time. While I was at the University of Maryland, I had many experiences that opened my eyes and expanded my worldview. There I had the opportunity to take a class that assigned us to interview residents in a neighboring town that is 76% Hispanic, with 1 in 5 students living below the poverty line. Through this assignment, I witnessed for the first time the reality of people who live in underserved immigrant communities in America. It was also at the University of Maryland that I took Arabic classes alongside first-generation Americans whose families were from Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. I also just want to point out here that Guilford High School is what introduced me to Arabic. So whoever takes Arabic in the audience or their children do, I definitely support that. And unfortunately, it was at the University of Maryland that a Black Bowie State University student, Richard Collins III, was murdered in a hate crime by a white University of Maryland student, just 2 minutes from the door of my on-campus apartment. I was not in Guilford anymore. The hard truth is that Guilford Public Schools prepared me to excel academically, but I was never prepared to exist in a diverse world. I was a star AP US history student. I gave walking tours around Guilford to tourists and curious residents to teach them the history of our historic homes and green. To say I was a history nerd was an understatement. Yet I never learned about Juneteenth, the Tulsa Race Massacre, the Tuskegee experiments, or the Move bombing. When nooses were found in the fraternity houses on my campus, I was unsure what to say or do to be an ally to Black sorority sisters and other members of the community. When neighbors we interviewed in Langley Park for our class assignment expressed their fears, their struggles, their inability to access proper health care and education for their children, the abuse they suffered as day laborers trying to provide for their families, I was completely unprepared to respond or comprehend. I took the highest level of history I could in high school. I was obsessed with the things I learned in my civics class, but I was never taught the complexities of race or immigration in America, the inequalities that existed and continue to exist. I was not prepared. In college, I felt smart when I was in a political science class critiquing John Locke. I was the first one to raise my hand. Guilford Public Schools had cultivated my confidence to speak in front of hundreds of classmates and articulate my opinions. But when I was in an American Studies class debating what whiteness meant, I was completely lost. I had no idea how to contribute to a conversation with non-white classmates whose experiences were nothing like mine. I didn't understand their families' histories, the systemic inequalities that kept their families in poverty, the racism that they faced at every turn. It is not lost on me that I could have chosen to continue with my sheltered education. I could have gone to a small, predominantly white college. I could have avoided all of these awkward scenarios. The thing is, Guilford Public Schools taught me to be curious. I was taught to debate, to learn from those who disagreed with me, and those whose experiences differed from my own. The thing is, you cannot enter the workforce in 2021 without acknowledging that America is imperfect, that many people were not privileged to grow up in a beautiful shoreline town where doctors, lawyers, and those with family wealth flourish. White people who proclaim that they don't see color in workplace diversity workshops are not rewarded. Even those of us who have dedicated effort to learning about historical inequalities and becoming a citizen in a diverse world have a lot of catching up to do. We have a lot more to learn. So, to the parents who do not want their children to learn history, who want to shelter them from the realities of our imperfect democracy, that is the biggest disservice you can do to your child. They will not succeed through ignorance. Trust those of us who are recent graduates from Guilford High School have entered a diverse modern workforce. Guilford needs to move forward, not backward, if they expect children who leave this town to be successful, to be leaders in their fields, to be educated, well-rounded members of society, and to make their hometown proud. We can no longer rely on our test scores, our extracurricular activities, our GPAs, our writing and debating skills to help us succeed as members of society. This next generation of adults need to be equipped with the historical context of inequality in America and skills in allyship at a minimum. That is the reality. If we don't catch up with the world, Guilford students will fall behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. I'd now like to introduce Grace Wagner, who graduated from GHS in 2014.
Hey, y'all. I am Grace Wagner, and I did my undergrad at UVM, which had pretty similar demographics to Guilford High School. And I now live in New Orleans, where I went to grad school for social work, and I'm a social worker at a trauma-informed school system. Sorry, I'm nervous. But Guilford will always be home and have a deep place in my heart. I want to share my story of moving to a new city with y'all in hopes that youth in the future have a very different experience than I had. When I left Guilford and entered the real world, I had the intention of doing anything I could to help others. I wanted to make an impact no matter how big or small. But I quickly learned that good intentions can be harmful if misinformed, which is a phrase that I really live by. During training for my new job at Teach for America, I quickly learned how severely misinformed I was. For the first time, I was no longer the majority when it came to race in the room with people around me. I suddenly, oh wait, no, I already read that. When it came to, wait, no, I already read that. And I was surprised how nervous I felt of offending anyone in that room. For the first time in my life, I was quiet and shy. As our TFA training continued, I became very aware of how much I had not learned in social studies throughout my time at Guilford Public Schools. I had never learned about the Tulsa Massacre. I stood at a rally in Atlanta right in front of the stage, and John Lewis was speaking, and I didn't even know who he was. I moved to New Orleans without having a clue who Ruby Bridges was. And that was just embarrassing and kind of unacceptable to me. And then worst of all, I had no idea what Juneteenth was or what it meant until Juneteenth came up while we were at training. I sat in a room with over 200 people, many people of color, sharing what that day meant to them, many in tears, and realized I had a lot more work to do learning about diversity than I had in teaching math. The guilt I felt was traumatizing, as my whole view of myself and my intentions completely reversed. I had no idea how to become culturally competent without offending someone of color by making a misstep or microaggression that could risk further burdening those around me who faced too much discrimination already. I am so fortunate to have had friends and colleagues who were patient enough with me and were willing to point out my mistakes so I could learn from them, even though it is not their job to teach me about my white privilege. I realized focusing on my guilt wouldn't help anybody either. It would not allow me to grow at all. And I was still focusing the entire concept of race around me as a white person. I had to learn how to fight the defensive-ness that so naturally came to me when these very hard subjects came up. And all that came with awareness, and I had to learn how to replace it with the willingness to seek out the knowledge on my own, because there were so many first-hand experiences already out there. And it's, like I said, not their job to teach me. It's my job to seek it out. It was hard and painful at times, very, very hard, a lot of tears and a lot of self-reflection. But change and growth aren't possible without going through discomfort. That's how we change and grow. I want the youth of this town who are so educated, because we do have a great school system, academic wise, for the most part, to have a very different experience once they leave Guilford than I had during my first few years in New Orleans. While it can be really difficult to realize how deep your privilege is, it's more traumatizing to learn it on the spot in a room with people that didn't have time for me and my confusion because they had already gone through discrimination for their whole lives. While it can't, oh wait, I already read that. But still, this trauma doesn't hold a candle to that of many people of color who live in a country based on systemic racism. Privilege is the ability to not have to think about your privilege. And we need to acknowledge that that's not something people of color can just forget about the way we can. Additionally, I recently realized Guilford has another growing issue. Of course, we need to change the curriculum, but I realized that we have become so divided that we are, in my opinion, losing a bit of our sense of humanity and compassion. Regardless of who wins in a few weeks, we are still one town that used to pride ourselves on our sense of humanity and compassion. I'm sorry, I keep doing that. All of us can get so heated in Facebook debates, myself included, really myself included, that we failed to really hear each other's stories. That is why I'm so glad that we can come together in a constructive way tonight to share our experiences. I hope that some real meaningful conversations will come from this forum, because I believe that deep down, every single person in this town wants all children to succeed and to be happy. These stories make it clear that an important step in that direction is updating the curriculum. If we truly want the youth of Guilford to have the best chance of success, we need to help them to avoid learning the hard way when they leave Guilford, like I did, and like Sam mentioned, and so many other people who have graduated from our high school and gone into the real world. But even if you disagree with this, I believe that treating other people with compassion is essential to keep our town from further dividing to the point of no return. Hate can be so powerful if it's just left unaddressed. My hope is that we can see each other's humanity no matter the outcome of November 2nd. I want us to replace anger and hate with unity and teamwork, and I believe that will keep us from permanently splitting the town into two groups. And together, we can help our kids better. We can help our kids better than we can by being apart. We are stronger together than divided, and I hope that we can choose kindness and giving grace to strive for community still rooted in love, unity, and acceptance. That's the Guilford I'm proud to come home to and to consider my home. Thanks.
Thank you, Grace. I'd now like to introduce Maria Elena de Fabio, who graduated in 2007.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for putting this together, Kara, and for everyone's stories. Can you hear me okay? All right. I started in the Guilford public school system in second grade. I attended A.W. Cox, Baldwin, Adams, and GHS. One of the main reasons my parents moved to Guilford is because of the schools. That is one of the driving reasons parents move anywhere. They want the best education possible for their children. I am presently in the midst of considering a move myself from New York City and have spent hours sifting through the New York Times Living In section where towns and neighborhoods are dissected for livability. Guilford has a nice one that you can look up. In these profiles, it's been interesting, though not surprising, to find that the highlights in the school system sections are always standardized testing metrics. And this research process has made me think about how my understanding of education reflected a similar sentiment during my years in the Guilford public school system. I think I can safely say that neither I nor any of my peers ever talked about why it was important to learn when we were learning. Instead, learning was a means to an end. A test that would decide whether or not you qualified for an AP class, which would then give you a leg up for when applying to college. And while this trajectory is not, this high test scores to building college credit to going to a good school is not in itself problematic, it doesn't mean much if the student on that trajectory learns to accept whatever they are taught without thinking twice in order to advance. In my experience of Guilford public education, there was no room for asking big questions. And most of the time it seemed like no one had any questions to begin with because what was taught seemed to fit nicely within our white privileged understanding of the world. And I'll admit that I didn't ask questions either. I accepted whatever truths I found in my history textbooks because I didn't know I could consider a different side of the story. In hearing others' stories tonight about specific moments when they realized the holes in their education, I think the fact that I have a hard time drawing up specific examples speaks for itself. I can think of a few major stumbles in my experience navigating this, but for me, it was more of a slow dawning of realization. I have been privileged enough to put my head in the sand on these issues for a long time, and it has manifested in me not knowing how to make anti-racism an active part of my life. In addition to feeling like school failed me in this way, I take full responsibility for my ignorance then and now. I know that many people forget a lot of what they learned in high school as they grow up. I do not think that my life has suffered greatly because I personally do not engage with, say, the Pythagoras theorem on a daily basis, but this sort of set it, then forget it attitude towards learning when it comes to subjects like systemic racism, class inequality, et cetera, is detrimental to Guilford's young people as students and humans. It's detrimental because these difficult fundamental truths about our country's founding are not confined to a textbook. We see them being acted out in the present day in widespread atrocities and microaggressions. These facts are not answers on a test. They are part of larger questions we should be continually asking of ourselves and others. I think Guilford public schools can, should, and must do better. They have an opportunity to teach their community of young people how to push for the truth and also how to fight for it. And I hope Guilford will rise to the occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. I'd now like to introduce Rebecca Eppall, who graduated in 2008.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Eppall, formerly Epler-Epstein, for those of you who knew me when I lived in Guilford. I graduated from Guilford High School in 2008. I attended Guilford Public Schools from kindergarten through 12th grade. And while I got a wonderful education in many ways in Guilford, I'm realizing more and more the ways that Guilford Public Schools failed me, my fellow white students, and students of color. As I'm sure you're aware, and we've heard tonight, Guilford is a predominantly white town with a predominantly white student body and teaching staff. In my K-12 educational experience, I learned almost nothing about non-white cultures, the oppression and marginalization of communities of color, the rebellions and resourcefulness of those same communities, or much other than Dr. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. I had no conversations about the policies and programs, both local and nationwide, that led to Guilford being a primarily white town. I had no conversations about what it means to be a white person in a world where people of color are systemically undermined, discriminated against, and oppressed. I had no conversations about how to be a white ally and accomplice to people of color. As I moved out of Guilford and attended a diverse college and proceeded to become an educator in predominantly Black and Brown communities, this lack of racial education meant that I committed microaggressions left and right, was not prepared to have meaningful and respectful relationships with people of color, and caused harm to the students of color I intended to teach. I internalized a white savior mentality where I was superior to my students and even their parents, and was going into impoverished communities to save the children in a community that I did not live in or feel a part of, a tremendously harmful mindset that I'm still working to unravel in my own conscious and subconscious thoughts and actions. As I continue to grow in my career in education, now serving as the Director of Education at the nonprofit UTech Inc. in Lowell, Massachusetts, I continue to unlearn harmful aspects of white supremacy culture that have permeated every way I have interacted with students and educational systems in my time as a student and as an educator. As I've developed a critical race lens, I've realized that many of the expectations I had of my students were based in a white supremacy model and perpetuated the racism that exists in our broader society. For example, when I required my students to sit quietly and follow every instruction given to them, I was actually teaching them to simply go along with the status quo, despite the fact that the status quo disadvantaged them. I've since learned to create classrooms where students are thinking critically, presented with information and asked to create their own meaning out of it. When that information led them to determine that something within our own system needed to change, I supported them in advocating for themselves to make change, an incredibly important skill that's too often only taught to white students. The students in the program I lead now hosted a candidate forum tonight for city council members in the towns that they live in to ask these candidates about the issues that affect them and their families, because they have been supported in seeing the challenges of our society and knowing what making change looks like. Ultimately, the limited racial education I received in Guilford schools did not give me the foundation I needed to see people of color as their full human selves. This led me to cause harm to my classmates in high school that I was completely unaware of at the time, and later prevented me from seeing and addressing the ways that I wasn't supporting my students of color the way they needed, seeing the root causes of their behaviors, what I labeled misbehaviors, that actually came from educational trauma. When I enacted harsher punishments against the Black boys in my classes, which is in and of itself part of the school to prison pipeline, it was because I failed to see their full history and address their needs as humans. I would have been far better prepared to do my job well and in an inclusive way had I learned the true racial history of the United States and been provided with opportunities to develop a critical race lens around oppression when I was a child and young adult. Perhaps I would have learned earlier to ask students questions and start from a place of curiosity about what's happening with the student, able to actually give them what they need to succeed, rather than jumping right to consequences. As I started to unlearn this internalized bias, I wanted to jump right into solutions. But in retrospect, I hadn't yet done enough work on my own mindsets to be able to create effective solutions. Instead, I started tokenizing students and including tokenized people of color in my curriculum in problematic ways. Only once I had time to process, especially with colleagues doing the work with me, was I able to overhaul my mindsets and my classroom to value and uplift the many varied experiences of my students. So it's clear to me that giving educators the time, space, and support to do the internal and external work to explore their own positions of power and internalized bias is just as important as the curriculum work that the BOE has already embarked on. I hope that the BOE will continue the progress that they have already made by implementing changes to the curricula based on the culturally responsive audit. And I hope that they will continue to provide training for all teachers on the ways that they can support and educate all students, regardless of their identities and inclusive of their identities. Thank you for being here tonight. And I hope that you join me and the others who have spoken tonight in embracing these goals of making Guilford schools a leader in raising anti-racist children who will go on to create a world based on respect and opportunity, not one plagued by the systemic racism we see today.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's really helpful to reflect on the classroom like that. I would now like to introduce David Chen, who graduated in 2010.
Sorry, just getting some technical issues over. Thanks everyone for joining, as well as everyone who is sharing their stories and to everyone who helped put this together. So updating Guilford's curriculum to be more diverse and inclusive, or in other words, complete, is critical to ensuring that future students can be thoughtful and impactful future leaders and citizens. The world has always been too complex and nuanced for simple stories and basic narratives, and yet unfortunately that has been too often the world presented, including in the classroom. It's not possible to meet the issues of today in our communities and our world without a deeper community of everyone in America. Ensuring that our curriculum is complete will not only make for better education, but also make for more thoughtful citizens who can lead our communities. Personally, some of my most valuable educational experiences really were from learning about the complex past, but this often wasn't actually in the classroom. When I was a student at Baldwin, the book Lies My Teacher Told Me, Everything Your American History Textbook Got Wrong, caught my eye. I was stunned to learn that my classes barely glossed over some major details. They were not just ignored. They were just completely missed over. For example, it was eye-opening to learn the true history of Christopher Columbus, including his poor sense of geography and geometry, but also his horrible violence that was condemned even for the time he lived in. The fact that structured history classes missed all these facts of the story taught me the value of critical thinking and to seek stories beyond whatever pages were presented. This was a consistent theme throughout a lot of my, history education at Guilford. There's always more complexity to the true story than what was shared in class narratives. We miss out on important opportunities for educational moments by not diving deeper into reality of history. There are chances to grapple with hard questions and allow students to think independently and critically. Updating the curriculum to address these gaps is a valuable chance to provide a better education for future Guilford students. Today also, our roles require us to have a more critical mindset and to be thoughtful citizens as we address more and more complicated issues. In my own work, which includes advising major health organizations and state governors on healthcare solutions and decisions, it's been essential to understand the complex history of the U.S. The U.S. famously spends considerably more than peer nations on healthcare, but has worse outcomes across a variety of measures. Social determinants like poverty, education, housing, which are inextricably tied to systemic racism and the history of our nation, are driving factors of these outcomes. To solve something like healthcare costs in the US requires understanding these issues and the past. And I have no doubt that this is the case for many of the issues that we face. And yet these were things I only learned about in college and beyond when I was able to engage with these issues and ideas and concepts related to diversity. In particular, my college experience in education was enriched because of the opportunity to take part in focused retreats and discussions with sort of diversity engaged programs. A lot of my most important lessons and perspectives came from deep discussions on complicated issues with my friends during my time there. And they're critical to my work today in understanding the complexity of something like healthcare. We would be missing a valuable chance to develop our future citizens if we don't update our curriculum. The world today is different from the one I grew up in. Back then, for example, there weren't many options for Asian food in Guilford or in Connecticut in general. And my family usually went out for Italian when we did. Now, there's 3 Thai restaurants in Guilford alone. My neighborhood in New Haven just had 2 ramen spots open up in the past year. I'm gastronomically delighted by these changes, but of course, I also see that reflects our changing census. It would be a disservice for the education development of our Guilford students to not have an education that equips them for a more diverse and connected world with more complex issues and problems. Ensuring a more diverse, inclusive curriculum is an important step towards that, shaping them into the citizens they'll need to be and lead us into the future. So thank you for joining and hearing everyone's stories and thoughts.
Thank you so much for sharing your story tonight, Dave. I'd now like to introduce our final speaker, last but not least, Taylor Hudak, who graduated from GHS in 2014.
Hi, everyone. I'm Taylor Hudak. I graduated in 2014. While attending Guilford, I received a high-quality education from the most amazing and inspirational teachers, some of who I see here tonight, so hi. Inspired by these teachers, I left for UConn with the dream of becoming a high school math teacher. I went on to obtain undergraduate degrees in math and math education, as well as a master's degree in curriculum and instruction. I am now in my 3rd year of teaching high school math, and I'm also pursuing a 2nd master's degree in gifted creativity and talented development at UConn. In high school, I recall my impression that racism was an ugly part of our past that had largely been remediated through civil rights legislation decades earlier. It strikes me that oftentimes curriculum involving people of color was relegated to fun facts in the margins of a textbook. The first time I encountered a class that opened my eyes to the reality of racism and inequities in our world today was in multicultural education, my senior year of college. I realized that my early education had left me in many ways ignorant to these issues, and I wanted to prepare myself to teach to all my students. Up until this point, my privilege as a white person living in Guilford had made it so I didn't have to acknowledge these inequities. I didn't see the systemic racism because I was benefiting from it. I have had the privilege of having a statistically more positive relationship with police officers, of having a lower probability of getting suspended from school, of attending a well-funded school district, of seeing people that have the same skin color as me in the curriculum or in positions of power, of having a wider selection of dolls that look like me on the shelves. The list goes on. Many people do not have these privileges. They don't get to choose when to ignore or acknowledge racism. Why did it take me until I was 22 years old to learn about this? Guilford's current curriculum is taking the necessary steps to become more relevant by teaching students how to become critical thinkers and thoughtful citizens. Guilford teachers are well equipped to deliver this curriculum in a way that is age appropriate and sensitive. A culturally relevant education has been shown to increase students' efficacy, motivation, and academic success. Students deserve and need to see themselves represented in the curriculum, and we are doing them a disservice if we shield them from reality. We aren't out here to make white students feel guilty. We want all students to feel comfortable discussing, understanding, and solving these issues, and the first step is a quality education. My college education in diversity, equity, and inclusion has helped me realize whose voices are speaking in my classroom and whose are missing. I consider my grading practices and what students have access to advanced courses. I teach my students to value different ways of communicating while being critical consumers of information. Many students don't realize that math can be manipulated in the media to confirm whatever someone is trying to say. Don't like how close two data points are? Change the scale. Your experiment didn't confirm what you wanted? Change the confidence interval. People can use numbers to argue that more white people are killed by police officers than people of color, but this doesn't adjust for population size, a classic mistake in proportional reasoning. Many students don't see these manipulations of math unless they are told to look for it. A culturally relevant math curriculum builds an informed society, connects math to students' cultural and community backgrounds, empowers students to confront real-world challenges, and teaches students to use their learning as a tool for social change, while delivering the same rigorous content in a way that is not only engaging, but actually increases academic achievement. I have seen the way Guilford students band together to address issues like gun violence and substance abuse. Many feel as though we need to protect our students, but have you ever talked to one of these students about a real issue? Our students are willing to speak up and are passionate about taking action. By giving them a culturally relevant education, we empower them with a voice. With a school culture that supports equity and social justice, just imagine how much more positive change these students can bring about. In these students lies our future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Taylor. That wraps up the story portion of our night. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to our stories tonight. I hope that you feel that you understand why recent GHS alumni are advocating for the Guilford curriculum to be updated to better reflect our country's history, to make clear the connection between historical policies and current inequities, and to foster an environment that is inclusive to people of all identities. You have heard many personal stories tonight from alumni who graduated from GHS in different years, who attended different colleges, and who hold different jobs. And yet, the message is the same. We left GHS with large holes in our understanding of the world and how people with different identities navigate it. We each had different experiences that led us to question that particular part of our education. And so here we are, telling our stories in the hopes that they might help others to understand the implications of the upcoming election for the Board of Education. I hope you will consider this when you fill in your ballot, either in person on November 2nd or beforehand by absentee ballot. You may have received an absentee ballot request in the mail, which you can fill out and send back to get your absentee ballot to vote. Or you can go to Town Hall and fill out a request form there, at which point you can give the request form back, they give you the ballot, you can hand that back and then vote it all in the matter of minutes. So thank you all again for listening, and we would be happy to answer your questions at this time. I see we've already received quite a few in the question and answer, so we can start moving through those, and please feel free to add more. I know it's 9, which was the original ending time that we planned, but I believe that many of our panelists may be happy to stay longer to address these questions. We already had a few who had to leave, but hopefully we can answer your questions for you. I see our first question is directed towards Sam. Could you please provide us with a sampling of banned books that are appropriate for elementary aged kids?
Yeah, I can actually reply and I can give the link that I used. So, and I'll reply on there. Can everyone see it if I reply? Or
I believe so. You should be, it'll go into the answered section and it'll just be typed. So can you click type answer, Sam?
Yeah, I can fill that out.
Great. All right, we have then a question that it seems like many of the parents opposed to DEI are worried that their students will begin to think outside of their parents' strict worldview or morals. Have anyone experienced this, and has anyone and have any thoughts on how this will work, how this work will impact child-parent relationships? Do any of our panelists want to jump in on that one? Perhaps one of our teachers. I don't know if you've had any response from parents based on your curriculum. Has it, you have parent-teacher conferences. Has this ever come up in any of those meetings?
Grace, if you want to jump in, feel free.
I just want to make sure I'm answering the question based on what Margaret is asking. But I can reflect on all the meetings I had with parents down here in New Orleans, and it was very different than the ones I assume happen up here. Many of my children or my kids' parents didn't want to talk to me because I was a white woman. They looked at me and they were like, nah. And it's not something that I felt I could just ignore. I felt like I had to, meet them where they're at, do my best to show them who I am, and all I want to do is help their child. And as far as in Guilford and other places, I think that, yes, we listen to our parents, but it's okay to disagree with your parents in a way that, for example, my parents, hi mom, she's on here. She has been on this journey with me, as is my dad. And we've all kind of grown together. We have checked each other when we say something that might not be on track with what we're trying to do. And it just goes to show that not only is it hard to talk about, but how important it is to talk about. And I hope parents are on board if their kid is asking them to talk about this. And if I am totally not answering the question that was asked, I'm sorry.
I think that adds a perspective, Grace. Emily, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think the question of whether or not, as Grace said, children will start to challenge their parents' authority on what reality is a concern that I'm sure every parent has gone through at some point in their life, whether or not their kid has DEI. If anybody's ever argued with a 3-year-old about what time bedtime is, it's the worst. So I think that is, I'm not a parent, but I imagine that is just part of parenting, is negotiating with your child what methods of authority you are comfortable exercising over them. And as children grow into adulthood, that's part of seeing your child as an entire person and not a product of who you want them to be. And I think high school is actually a very, very good time to be having those conversations with your child, to be negotiating with that person who they are and how they see the world as an individual, and not what you want them to be as a reflection of your personal morals. I would also say, just on a very micro scale, Eliza had brought up the experience of being non-binary and queer in town. I'm queer. I didn't come out to myself until after high school. And I think that there are parents who are afraid that if their children have access to information about sexuality and gender, that they will reject personal or cultural or religious teachings that their parents hold very dear. And I would just offer to anybody who has those fears that I would hope that the fear of not having a child who is loved for who they are is a greater fear than disagreeing about what cultural context you want to perceive them in, or how you would want your child to exist in the world and love your kid as a full individual. Because I think I know that conversation specifically around gender and sexuality does happen a lot in families at the high school level, and like will continue to happen whether or not these DEI measures are instituted. I'd also just like maybe talk to your kids and like talk to your kids. They're smart.
I also, on that note, I think as so many of us have talked about here, we weren't having these conversations when we were living with our parents and then went out to someplace else, whether that be college or wherever else, where we started to realize how much we were missing and how much we hadn't had these conversations. And so wouldn't it be so nice as a parent to be part of that process and be able to have these conversations with your kids as they're coming up and as they're processing these things, and be part of that conversation and not have this change happen after we've left your homes and we're sort of navigating this separately, and then coming back and feeling this tension about what we learned when we were living with parents, you know. And I think many of us have talked about what that looks like. My parents are also on this call, and we've also had many conversations, you know, throughout the years about our own growth. And so I think we're going to learn, hopefully, at some point by living in the world that's bigger than Guilford, that this bubble is not everything. And so if you're a parent who wants to have a relationship with your child as an adult, not just when they're living under your roof, I think it's important to be able to have that conversation with them throughout.
Thank you. I think all of you added really great perspectives to that question. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add before we move on to the next question? Grace, you have something else you want to say?
I was just going to say that I am, you know, also queer. I'm bisexual, and I was never able to say that in Guilford because I was scared that I was going to be rejected. But the second I left, I was able to tell my family. I felt accepted by all the people who were around me. And hearing that other people had issues, you know, being able to come out and do that, it makes me wonder if we have a lot of marginalized issues or topics, concepts, you know what I mean, to address, because I really, Emily, I really resonated with what you just said. That's it. I'm done.
Thank you for adding that, Grace. Yeah, it does seem to be a theme. If people haven't been given the tools to be able to have these discussions in high school, it happens later in life once they have received those tools one way or another. Next question. It's critically important, given the tenor of the argument here in Guilford BOE, to differentiate and explore. Does a diversity, equity, and inclusion education make our kids, quote, feel bad about being white, end quote, as some parents propose, or does it give them the knowledge and tools to promote healing and justice in their lives? Does anyone from our speakers want to hop on to answer this?
I can jump in there because I know I talked a lot about whiteness and how I learned about whiteness once I went off to college. I'm clearly very white and grew up in Guilford, you know, was born and raised in Guilford and was surrounded by other very white people and many Irish Italian Catholics, as I am. And so I was used to being surrounded by people who are almost exactly like myself, I felt. And when I went off to college, I obviously was being educated more properly, I feel, in what whiteness was and what that meant historically and what that meant socially. And I could tell you, I never sat there and was like, poor me. Like, oh my gosh, I'm white and this is like the worst thing in the world. I've always been very proud of my heritage. I'm very proud of my Italian American immigrant grandparents who made their way from New Haven with no money at all into North Branford. And then my parents were able to give me an amazing life thanks to their hard work. I've always been proud of that, as I am of my Irish side. But I realized that there were a lot of flaws in that history as well. They were not perfect people. You know, the Irish and Italians were not welcoming to Black people in New Haven. And that's something I've reckoned with, as I'm still proud of my own heritage. And it does not, learning that others, you know, were harmed by people who look like me and who, you know, possibly ancestors of mine, does not make me feel guilty per se. It more so makes me feel like I have to do more to be a better individual and to help the future generations be better. So I think it's really a reckoning with our own history. But I could personally say I never felt like I was being targeted or harmed in any way by that education. In fact, I was grateful that I was being educated in that way and that I wasn't sitting there totally unaware of my context in the world.
Thank you, Heather. Grace, did you want to say something? Oh wait, we have some people who haven't spoken in the Q&A yet. See, Courtney, you raised your hand.
Yeah, similar to what Heather said, I am also extremely white and present that way. And when I kind of realized what was going on in terms of not getting a full diverse education, I think I was just, more than being guilty, just more interested in seeing what I can do better. And I think a lot of kids, we don't give them enough credit in trying to strive to do better. So for me, it wasn't, oh my God, what did I do wrong in the past? It's, well, what can I do better in the future? And how can I push that forward to the people that I work with? Or, you know, when I'm training somebody at my job, what can I teach them to kind of get, pay it forward to just each generation of new student, nurse, whatever, having a more diverse outlook and being more culturally sensitive. And then there was this one other thing that I had learned, and I don't know how much it applies here. And if I am saying something wrong, I would love for somebody to please correct me. But when we learned about gender and pronouns, and we talk about this at the hospital as well with patients, if you misgender a patient or a person in your day-to-day life, how you should handle that is more just acknowledging, saying, oh, my bad, and then saying the next thing, instead of saying, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I keep doing this wrong. And I don't know if that translates the same to this feeling of doing something wrong racially, but the more you apologize and feel this guilt, you're putting more guilt onto that minoritized population. You're kind of throwing that back to them, that they should tell you, oh no, it's okay that you misgendered me, or oh no, it's okay that you you had this microaggression. So I think the focus should not be so much on our guilt, but on just doing better the next time, if that made sense.
That did make sense, Courtney. Yes. Sam, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think what I'm thinking of too is, like, I feel like the white guilt almost comes from not teaching about these things and then learning about them kind of after the fact, like after you leave high school. And I think when you actually have these conversations with young students, and what I see with my students, even kindergartners and that I've worked with, they do feel more empowered, like the other half of the question, and feel more able to stand up for people. And it's less of white guilt and more of feeling like they can do more about it and change things, and more curious about learning. And that's just what I've seen.
I think it depends a lot on the moment that someone learns in and the situation that they're in when they learn it. I think Grace and I both told stories about feeling guilty. And, you know, I realized my ignorance in a moment where I was actively harming someone. And so the process of learning was like quite jarring and difficult, because it came with the knowledge of something that I had never intended to do to my best friend and yet had done. But now knowing it and going forward in life, I don't feel guilty to be a white person. That's how I was born. I think that I've heard a very good comparison, just a way to think about this, and I don't remember who said this, so I can't give credit, but the idea of, for example, inheriting a hotel that doesn't have, or you buy a hotel that doesn't have like accessible ramps and ways for people to access the hotel. And you don't feel guilty for getting this hotel in that way. But now that you're the owner of that hotel, you need to make it accessible to everyone going forward. And now it is your duty as the owner of that hotel to make sure everyone can access it. I think that is a good way to think about this going forward. It's like not that you have to feel guilt for what the world you have come into and the way that centuries of systemic racism have left the world in its present day, but more once you learn about how that happened and the policies that created the current world, that you can then actively work to make it better for everyone. And I think that's empowering when you learn that. I don't think that it's something that will make people feel guilty unless they're learning it in a moment where they're harming someone, in which case it does come with guilt, but that's like contained, I think, more so in that moment. And all the more reason to teach people in kind of a safe space of a classroom where it's a structured, purposeful learning environment. Does anyone else have anything to add? There were quite a few questions about this.
I'd love to jump in on this as well. Yeah, there are a few questions that I'm kind of pulling some thoughts around. I really appreciate that analogy, Kara, and what I've been sort of taught, and that's been really helpful for me as an educator, is the phrase, "It's not my fault and it is my responsibility." It's not my fault that I'm in the situation I'm in. The history of this country is not my fault. And it is my responsibility in the position I am situated in right now with the identities that I hold to make it better for those who come after me. And that's been really, really helpful for me in navigating someone in the chat was talking about Brene Brown, and she talks about the difference between guilt and shame, which I also think is really helpful, because a lot of what we're talking about here is actually shame. It's this idea that I am a bad person. If I am a white person, must be a bad person. And that's not what we're getting at here, right? Like we're getting, the idea is that as a white person, I hold privilege, and I have therefore the responsibility and the power to make change and to give up some of that privilege and create a more equitable world. Guilt is actually really helpful, right? Like when we've done something wrong, we should feel guilty and we should do something to make amends for it. So yeah, when we're learning in a moment where someone's calling us on something we did that really harmed someone, feel that guilt, sit with it, live with it, and then do better, make amends and repair that relationship, repair that harm. So I think it's really helpful to differentiate that, like, I did a bad thing, guilt, from I am a bad thing, shame. And what we're trying to teach here is to identify the places where we should feel guilt, to be able to do something about it and do better in the future and amend, like repair the harm that we've caused, but not feeling shame for being who we are. We get to live in our identities. We also get to be full human people. And we also get to make mistakes, but part of being a human and making mistakes is going back and trying to fix them. So I think that kind of got it a couple of different places. Oh, there was someone, Mary asked a question, asking sort of that there should be a space for students to process these feelings. Absolutely. I think that's critically important when we're having conversations in any classroom environment, is to have space and supports for educators to hold that space for students to be able to process their emotions. Whenever we're learning something that's challenging, and if we're not learning something that's challenging, are we really learning? So whenever we're in these spaces of learning, I think it's really important to be able to sit with students' emotions and hold space for that and help students process.
I just wanted to say real quick about that. Most of the things I've learned have been from misstepping or making a mistake, and then don't harp on it, because that puts the person in this awkward position of, now I have to comfort them about being upset about the thing that they said that was wrong. So I just wanted to say that real quick.
Can I throw one last thing in on this question, Kara? Which is that I also think that sometimes this question, in the context that it's asked, is a little bit of a red herring, because parents make their kids feel guilty all the time and make them face the consequences of what they've done all the time for missteps and issues. And I think that's part of being a parent and being somebody who's guiding a young person through problems and issues. And the idea of like, well, I don't want my kid to feel bad, I don't always think is like actually true. I think the statement that they mean to say, or maybe I'm putting words in people's mouths, but sometimes I think that the implied intention is, I don't want my kid to feel bad about something that I don't care if they change or not. And that, I think, reflects much more on the ideals and morals and stances of the parent than it does whether or not the kid will feel a certain way. And learning to deal with negative emotions, whether they be guilt or shame or regret, is part of learning how to be a human in society. And I personally have like felt guilt and shame around racism, and I think that's fine because it has moved me towards, I think, a better intention in the future. And that guilt and shame has never actually really come from people of color. That guilt and shame has mostly come from other white people in like talking about these things. So yeah, I think the like core of that question is sometimes not genuine. Sorry, my words.
All good, Emily, thank you. I think we have time for just one more question. So I'd like to concentrate on this question. What many of you have been describing seems to be culture shock, for lack of a better term, and the discomfort that can go along with that. You have talked a lot about a lack of preparation in GPS to deal with this. What specifically would have better prepared you for your experience? And is there any preparation that you believe could teach you as much as your actual experiences when you left Guilford? I can jump. Oh, Taylor, yes, go ahead.
I would just say, like, in education about it, like the more that you talk about it, then the less culture shock there is. It just like doesn't make sense to just not talk about it. Like, even though the best thing is real experiences, but if you come out of Guilford Public Schools with knowledge about even what terms mean or what examples of things are, like someone asked, what are microaggressions? And a lot of people don't know what it is. Or I went to college and I didn't know what this term meant. The more tools that you have to understand the world and to analyze things and to know what people are going through and reading stories in school, even if you are a white teacher trying to teach your white students, that is a majority of Guilford, you can still empower them with facts and with information and with open conversations.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Taylor said. And I think a lot of our stories touched upon some of that, of like, we experienced this thing, but we didn't even know how to react to it at the time. So like personally, you know, being surrounded by a community that was right next to my college that was so vastly different than anything I experienced before, where many people were living in poverty, many people were immigrants to this country, many were being exploited as day laborers. Like, I didn't know what a day laborer was until I went to college. I didn't know that, you know, people were still being exploited in the workforce. I didn't know that there were health inequities. Like, these things were just not taught. And I watched the news every day as a kid. So I definitely was like trying to keep up with what was happening in the world, but it wasn't happening in the classroom, and it wasn't being reinforced, I guess, in the classroom. And, you know, I think just having the background knowledge, having like the understanding that this country is not perfect. I think I grew up thinking America was like the most perfect place in the whole world. Like there was nothing wrong. And that was a culture shock for me when I learned that that was definitely not the case. And so I think, you know, we've touched on whitewashed history and a few different things like that, and just incorporating in the curriculum that like Juneteenth exists. You know, I think Mr. Colton was on the call. I don't know if he still is, but that slavery existed in Guilford. Like, you know, I'm glad that that's in the curriculum now, but for many of us, we never even knew that. So these small little tidbits can make such a difference. And so if we really look at the curriculum and see where there are gaps, I think that could be, it could reduce the culture shock, despite, you know, still Guilford being Guilford and still having a majority white community here.
Can I add a little more to that? So like Heather had said earlier, and I think a few other people mentioned it, Guilford is really big on their AP classes, and I feel like a lot of people are taking AP US history, and you know, there's so much focus on, for an example, in that a DBQ, which is the big long essay that you have to do on something. I think if you substitute out some standard question from that and you give an example of a racial inequity or something that happened in the past, and have the essay that follows from that be, how is that currently impacting lives today? We'd be able to have that conversation, even just in that one class. And I think high schoolers are capable of a lot more than we give them credit for, and teaching them how to read critically, how to look at research, even at a basic level, can help them see that, you know, statistics can be manipulated, but this is what's been going on. And I just think that we had a lot of opportunities that perhaps were missed to have a more culturally sound education.
Yeah, for me, the term and the concept of systemic racism would have been a very helpful thing to learn about. So yeah, learning about all those parts of history, the less, I don't know, the parts of history that we are not proud of when we think about them, and thinking about how that has a through line to today and how that has created systemic racism. I think there are many, many ways to teach that. And I wish it was kind of taught throughout. As Sam brought up, not just in history even, and this could be incorporated in all of our classes. It is so ubiquitous in the reality of America. Anyone else have any comments before we wrap up? We're already half an hour over our original end time. Thank you so much to everyone who stuck with us. Grace, did you have something you want to say?
I forgot about the time difference. My bad, y'all. I just was gonna say, because I feel bad, I was the reason that Shelly's question got moved and not answered. Shelly, if you want to reach out, or anyone does, I am happy to share some. But real quick, I just want to say, I was at Walmart here in New Orleans, all the white hair care products out for everyone to take. All the Black women's hair products, that it's all locked up. So it's things kind of like that you see the differences in how people are treated. They're very subtle, but they can also be very obvious. But yeah, reach out if you guys have any questions. I love to talk about this stuff.
Thanks, Grace. Yeah, sorry, Shelly. I think everyone, all of us talked about having committed microaggressions. There were some examples scattered throughout of ones that we've committed or ones that people have experienced, but we'd be happy to give more, I'm sure. All right, Joe, did you have any final closing words?
Yeah, just real briefly. Thank you, Kara. The Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, has amazing resources on microaggressions. So maybe what we'll do is post some examples of them on the Guilford Human Rights Commission's Facebook page. We'll tag them right under this event so that everyone can find them easily. And then if any of you have anything that you want to add, any examples, you can just chime in right underneath. I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank Kara for organizing this event. We really just provided the platform. Kara is responsible for everything you've seen tonight and deserves a ton of credit. And I also wanted to thank all of the panelists for being open, vulnerable, honest. I know this was a scary experience for some of you, and nerve-wracking, and I think you all did an outstanding job. And I also want to thank all of our attendees for being here with us tonight, and to say again that a video recording of this event will be available within the next few days. So you can look for that on our Facebook page. And I'm sure all of these panelists will be sharing that as well. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Kara, for doing this. And have a great night.
Yeah, thank you, Kara.
Good night, everyone.
Night.